All right, so welcome everybody. I'll wait a little bit longer till people file in, but while I'm doing that, I'll answer some of the easy questions you asked. Have I truly never had pimento cheese? I have had it now, thanks to um, somebody who sent me some after I was in Atlanta, and so I have now had it. It's different. My brother-in-law loves it beyond all things. He's from North Carolina. I think maybe it's something you need to grow up on, but I didn't dislike it. So I have had pimento cheese. Other people have asked me, Ogden Dunes, hey, Ann, how are you? Other people have asked me why I am still on Twitter, or X as it is now known, and why I haven't left that platform, although I am on many others. I'm not using them nearly as efficiently as I still am using Twitter. You are completely right that it has become a cesspool. I mean, it's bad. Musk is deeply problematic. I mean, I could go on at great length. But the reason I haven't left is because the other social media websites don't have direct messages, and a lot of I do a lot through direct messages, first of all, and people send me a lot of tips and everything through direct messages, but also because journalists have not left Twitter, and that's really what I use it for, is seeing what news is out there, what the breaking stories are, and that it's just I'm not up to speed yet on the other social media and using X. So I'm not there ideologically. I'm there because so far we don't have another social media site that handles direct messages. So that's why I am there. All right. Some questions then that you all wanted me to talk about. So first of all, let's start with, again, more easy ones. I'll go from the real easy ones into more and more difficult ones. So somebody asked a question about inflation, two questions about inflation actually. And one of the questions was that somebody said that Joe Manchin had saved Joe Biden on inflation by making the Build Back Better Act less expensive, and somehow that had done something to inflation, and what on earth were they talking about? So the argument behind that is that by one of the things that causes inflation is if there's a lot of money in the economy, because people are they have more money and they're willing to pay more money for more goods. And this is one of the places that you're seeing price gouging, for example, from big corporations that have raised their prices and are making really big margins, profit margins. And you see that in basically most of the big corporations doing that. So the more money there is out there, the more people can spend and the higher inflation can get. The argument that Biden did not have the kinds of inflation he might otherwise have had because Joe Manchin, from a senator from West Virginia, kept that package smaller than it was going to be, I think people would argue that in a number of different ways. A couple of things about that. The piece of the Build Back Better Act that did not go into law were the pieces that worked for caregivers, especially elder care, child care, and educators. And people like me think that it would have been a very good thing to put money behind those things, not least because it would have brought money into every community in the country, because everybody needs child care and everybody needs elder care and everybody needs kindergartens. So I have always thought it would be a really good way to rebuild the economy is to fund those things and not concentrate so much on building new manufacturing plants. But the other thing about inflation is, somebody said, I retweeted something this morning and she didn't understand what I had said, and that's that when they calculate inflation, they calculate it in all sorts of different ways, and different pieces of the government look at different things. So new numbers came out today that said in the last month inflation was 0. Now, I actually haven't read the studies myself because they come in two ways. One of the ways they calculate inflation doesn't take into consideration gas, food, and housing in different orders, and the other one does. And I don't know which one that was because I haven't read it yet. But the reason that that's important, of course, is that Biden argued all along that by jump-starting the economy, they could then raise interest rates. So jumpstart the economy, put a lot of money into it to repair all the businesses that were hurt during the pandemic. And then they could raise interest rates, which have been artificially low for a really long time. They should have been dialed back at least by the Trump administration, and he didn't want to do it because it slows economic growth. They believed they could raise interest rates and keep everybody employed, but slow down inflation. And a lot of people said, no, this can't be done, where it's going to be rampant inflation, the whole thing. And they did it, and it worked, which is huge and ought to be frontline news, because the United States has had the best economic growth of any developed country since the pandemic, and the lowest inflation. So those are both huge deals that we need to be shouting more from the rooftops. I will say on inflation, every time I say that, somebody says, oh, come on now, inflation's hitting me really badly. And I think the answer to that is twofold. It's this. First of all, there have been extraordinary rises in wages, but they've been primarily at the bottom of the economy. So if you're above that, you haven't seen that. But second of all, I'm with you. For all that we have more money and that the inflation has been lower than increases in our wages and all that, or most of us, man, you look at those prices in the grocery store and you just about have a coronary. Even if you know the marginal rates, and if you know how the economy is growing and all that, I can't help, because we didn't have much inflation for so long. In my mind, what do I buy? A can of tomatoes should be a certain amount of money. And then when I look and it's $2 more, I'm the same way. But that's actually, I think, more psychological than it is a reflection of the economy, which is actually very, very good. All right. The other thing that I would love to see talked about more when we talk about taking money out of the economy, is another way to do that is through taxes, of course. And that's something that I'm going to start pushing more, because I care about tax policy a lot. And we just don't even talk about it, which is weird, because it has always been the centerpiece of managing the economy since 1861. And the fact that it's like, no, we're just going to cut taxes and not talk about using taxes to deal with the budget is just weird, when the budget deficit that we're dealing with is not because we've increased domestic spending at all, or, by the way, that we have increased military spending in relation to how much stuff we make around the country. That's known as GDP. Those have stayed virtually unchanged since the 1950s, with the exception of a spike during the coronavirus pandemic. What has changed is the George W. Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts. That's what's put us in the red. And those don't go to those only go to the people at the very top and to corporations. So I feel like those should be back on the table. All right, so that's some of the stuff here. Inflation you asked about. So people have asked a number of questions here that just are worth throwing into the mix here. And that is, you've asked some questions about Trump's speeches lately, and about the 2025 project, which is being put together by Trump supporters, but not just for Trump, rather for anybody Trump or Trump-like who could be elected in 2025. And what on earth is I'm sorry, I'm trying to read as we go here. What on earth is going on with those projects? Just to do a big picture thing here, there are those of us who believe in democracy. We believe in the institutions of democracy. And those institutions at this point are very complicated. There are a lot of them. There are checks and balances. And I don't mean just like the big things in government. I mean the agencies and the bureaus and all the things that balance stabilize our government. But there are people on the right now who don't want that. They don't like democracy. They don't like the fact it treats everybody equally, which means that women can have jobs outside the home and they don't have to answer to their husbands, and they can decide when to have children. They don't like that there is now in the United States an emphasis on racial equality. They like the idea of there being racial hierarchies. And crucially, a number of them also don't like the idea of a secular society. They want to impose Christianity on the rest of us. And they've gone through all kinds of gyrations to make it sound as if all of those things are written in the Constitution, and they're not. They're just not. And I'm not going to go into that right now because there's other stuff as well. But But they are trying to overturn our democracy. They're trying to get rid of the system in which the laws protect us all equally and replace it with Christian nationalism, which is turning the country into a theocracy so that, white men have control over their wives and children, and certainly over people of color. And the thing that you will see in the Trump policies is an expression of that very strong government, because the Republicans after 1981 believed in a small government that stayed out of people's ways. Now the Trump Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, want a large government that forces the rest of us to behave in certain ways. So Trump and his people are not being quiet about this. They're boasting of it. They're coming out and they're talking about it, because they want to convince their base that they're part of this strong movement, and they want to make other people afraid and to feel as if they don't have any options going forward. So, for example, what you have heard is that Trump and his people have said that they are going to get rid of the nonpartisan civil service and only put people who support Trump into office, and they have to share his ideology. So that means that it's your local town clerk, or your state secretary of state, or anybody who holds a political office needs to be loyal to Trump. Well, think about what that means. Think about what that looks like. That means that you would have no legal recourse. So nowadays, if I go to somebody and they discriminate against me based on the fact that they think I shouldn't be allowed to have a bank account, for example, I could sue over that. But you wouldn't be able to under those circumstances. And certainly if you're a person of color, good luck, but it's not just like, nobody escapes that. And if you don't get what I'm saying there, imagine, for example, being in Hungary, where Viktor Orban is a real beacon of light to these people. And Orban took a democracy and insisted that everybody had to be loyal first to his party and then to him. And, if you had a business and he wanted to give that to one of his cousins, you were invited to sell it at very low cost to him and get out with whatever you could, or it would simply get taken. And that, it didn't help necessarily that you were of his party or anything else. So long as it was something he wanted, you ended up losing it. So they've talked about doing that. They have talked most recently about politicizing the Department of Justice. And they're trying to argue that Biden politicized the Department of Justice against Trump and the January 6 rioters, and that is their way of giving themselves an excuse for trying to do the same thing to the Bidens and to people who have opposed Trump. Biden has deliberately kept every possible hand off of the Department of Justice. He even left in place, it's quite unusual, he left in place special I can't think of the word. Not special prosecutor. It wasn't a prosecutor. Special investigator who was looking into Hunter Biden. That's David Weiss, and he was appointed by Trump, and he's been in office for 5 years. And this is the person that the Republicans are trying to say was being pushed around by the Biden administration. And yet, behind closed doors last week, Weiss said to Republicans, "No, they've always given me a free hand." So Trump has openly said that he is going to use the Justice Department against his enemies, the same way that Russian oligarchs or Ukrainian oligarchs did against their enemies, and that means basically the state will become in the service of Trump. And then finally, they're talking, not finally, but one of the other things they're talking about doing is, of course, getting rid of any abortion rights and rounding up about 10 million undocumented immigrants, people who've applied for asylum, and it is legal to apply for asylum in the United States, people who hold humanitarian visas, or people who were born to undocumented immigrants who, under our laws, have birthright citizenship. That is, if you're born here, you're a citizen of the United States. They want to get rid of that as well. And because that would be so difficult to deport 10 million people, they want to build large camps to put them in as they wait to be deported. And if anybody doesn't hear the echoes there of concentrating people into camps, at the same time that the former president is talking about vermin that word vermin that he intends to remove from America, you really better take a look at any genocide that suits your fancy, although people are pointing to the Nazis. That's the kind of language that people used in virtually any genocide. They start to refer to their enemies as bugs or as rodents. It's pretty, it's a historical pattern. Great historical pattern, huh? All right, so Trump is in fact sounding more and more extreme. I think he's doing that for two reasons. I think he's doing it to convince his followers that they're part of something new and exciting, and that they will bring in this new era and they can feel like they have a piece of it. But I also think he's very frightened about his own legal troubles. And that is, for all that he's blustering about them, remember, a judge did find that the Trump Organization and Trump and two of his older sons and two employees of the Trump Organization have committed fraud. And he's in danger of losing control, not just losing control, but losing the ability to do business in New York City, which is a huge deal for him. That's his financial base. And of course, he's got the E. Jean Carroll case where he has been found liable for sexual assault. And the judge said that what he did would be considered rape by anybody who was not operating under New York's peculiar laws. And by peculiar, I don't mean weird. I mean, they are peculiar. They are unique to the state of New York. And then he's got these other cases where he has come out and said he thinks that Eileen Cannon is protecting him because he appointed her. Somebody ought to look into that, by the way. She was appointed at the very end of his term. And so he feels like that's off the table, but he's clearly worried about both Georgia and the case in Washington, D.C. over January 6th. It's being run by Jack Smith. So I think he's very worried about that, and he's trying to rile up people to fight for him. Whether or not they will do so is another question, but I think that's very much what he's going for. Even today, for example, somebody just said hi to Buddy. Even today, I came home last night, and it's really nice to be home. I'm leaving again tomorrow, but it's nice to be home. He's at work, by the way, or I wouldn't be sitting here chatting. So I think that he is definitely trying to rile people up. And even today, he retweeted or reposted a statement of somebody saying that there should be a citizen's arrest of the judge who is overseeing the case in Manhattan. I mean, crap like that. He's just pushing the envelope as far as he possibly can because he knows people will act on it the way that man acted on his attacks on Nancy Pelosi and went after her husband. It's horrific. But anyway, more questions here quickly. I want to come back to the idea of violence. We have some time here. Let's go to violence. Because I think I can tie some things together here. People asked about, first of all, let's go into it this way. Why did the Republicans back Mike Johnson? Mike Johnson is a Christian extremist from Fayetteville, Louisiana. He never ran, he was never opposed in an election. He has virtually no experience of anything. And it turns out the more we get to know him that he is deeply problematic, not only with the things he said on a podcast that he and his wife ran, but also because his finances are really unusual. I think I'm comfortable using the word shady, although because they are so obscure, it's a little bit difficult to tell. Somehow, although he has a salary of over $200,000 and has gotten retainers from doing a bunch of legal stuff, he doesn't have a bank account. Anyway, there were lots of reasons not to elect him, especially when the Republicans were trying to get away from the MAGA Republicans, the extremists. And I think the answer to that, having not been party to any of these discussions, is that the far-right Republicans just refuse to compromise. And I've written about this because they believe that they are backed by God, because they want to destroy the government. That's the point. They want to get rid of the government under which we live. And because they think they're on the right, they don't compromise, and they've never compromised. And what that's meant is it's made the Republicans move farther and farther and farther right, because they won't compromise. So if something needs to give, the moderates give. And what happened was it looked as if the Republicans could find a compromise. I mean, mind you, at any point they could work with the Democrats. I mean, the Democrats are like, hey, we're not chopped liver over here. We're happy to work with you. And they refuse to do it because they know that the extremists would then just cut the moderates off, or not the moderates, the rest of the Republicans off at the knees. So they're refusing to work with the Democrats. And it looked as if they could get someone like Tom Emmer, who was, still out there, but at least he's, seemed like he would be more reasonable. And the MAGA Republicans just said no. All they have to do is sit there saying no, and everybody dances circles around them. Surely you have known people like this in your lives, who just say, no, I'm not going to do it. And there's nothing you can do. You are not the boss of me. And that's what the MAGA Republicans are. And so the Republicans, I think, somebody asked, do I think Trump has dementia? I am not a doctor. I don't have any idea what's going on, but something definitely is going on. I can talk about that if you want. But so why did they settle on Johnson? I think because they knew how embarrassing it was by then. It had been 3 weeks. Nobody has ever in American history kicked out their speaker before, which was embarrassing enough. And then it had been 3 weeks and they couldn't agree on anyone. And they got this guy who kind of looks the part, and nobody really knew who he was. And they figured that they could at least get somebody in that chair. So they jumped on board without adequately vetting him. And now they are stuck with him unless they decide to vacate the chair again, which of course they don't want to do. But what that has meant, because it's going to look even stupider, right? But what that's meant is that they have somebody who doesn't really know what he's doing. He just, I'm not saying that to be mean, although it's definitely true, but think about the fact that Nancy Pelosi, with the same split that the Republicans have, got through some of the most landmark legislation in our history because she knows how to do it. It's not a question of just sort of guessing and hoping and praying. It's a question of knowing how people are going to vote, knowing when to call the vote, knowing what you can trade here for something over there. And Johnson just doesn't have those relationships, so he doesn't know how to do that. Plus, it's a certain personality. I would be terrible at it myself. He clearly doesn't know what he's doing. So now they're in this bizarre position of trying to get through these must-pass laws. And already the far right has said no. So once again, Johnson, the vote is any minute, is going to have to, hey, Gwen, how are you? Is going to have to turn to the Democrats again to see if they can get this thing through. The way every time they come up with something to protect the government funding, they have to turn to the Democrats. And then they get in trouble with the far right. So I think that that's why they said yes to Johnson. But now they are in this bizarre position that is bizarre in a couple of ways. The far right is still unwilling to do anything. Still, I mean, some of them are saying, well, we'll give Johnson a 45-day honeymoon, so we'll go ahead and vote for what he wants now, but we'll throw him out later. Others are simply saying, absolutely not, we're not going to work with him. So he's back to exactly where McCarthy was when he got thrown out. And so I think one of the things you've asked about is what on earth is happening today, where you've had former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy elbowing one of the people who threw him out of office, one of the 8 who threw him out of office, violently enough that an NPR reporter was shocked. And then in the Senate, this was bizarre, you had Senator Mullins of Oklahoma wanting to get into a fist fight with a union leader that was testifying before the Senate. And it's like, would you people grow up? And one of the things we're seeing is a situation that looks very much like that of the 1850s. And what that was about was a minority of people who recognized that they didn't have the ability to govern and they are doubling down on the idea that they can just bully their way through things at a time when in fact you actually need to have some skills that they don't have. So there's these fist fights are breaking out not over policy but over personalities being like, I'm going to be the biggest dog in the room here. And one of the things that was interesting that happened in the House was that James Comer from Kentucky, who runs the House Oversight Committee and he's been out in front of the Fox News channel and all kinds of places insisting that Biden has committed financial crimes. I promise you there is no evidence of this, none, because I read all these things and it's all innuendo. There's nothing there. Yet it also turns out that Comer himself had a bunch of dealings that were for similar amounts of money that do in fact look like there was something there. And a Democratic House member called him out on that today, and Comer freaking lost it. And that reminded me again of the 1850s and of a very special, specific moment when the Southern enslavers had been throwing their weight around for a long time and sort of blustering and bullying and fist fights, and they beat Charles Sumner over the head until he almost bled to death, and he had fractured his skull, and all kinds of stuff. But in this critical moment when they went after Sumner, finally somebody from the North stood up. A guy named Anson Burlingame from Massachusetts stood up and he said, that's it. We've put up with this crap, not his word, for way too long. We will fight back. And when that happened, the Southerners were all like, oh my God, he threatened us. How dare you threaten us? But it changed the dynamic. And watching Moskowitz today, I think it was Moskowitz, going after Comer, not yelling at him, not doing anything, but being like, come on, dude. And watching how upset and flustered Comer got. It's like somebody finally called the bullies out. So I think that is what you saw happening today with McCarthy going after one of the people who threw him out, and with Mullen going after a Senate witness. I mean, come on. And also Comer losing it. They recognize that they're a political minority. They recognize that they don't, as a party, have the ability to govern. They look like idiots, and they're mad at each other because there's no policy to argue over. They're arguing over personalities. All right, so somebody says I love Anson Burlingame. We should start I would love to say more about the Anson Burlingame, but there's more stuff you want to talk about here. So somebody asked, I want to make so the question is, somebody asked, is this going to lead to a civil war? We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I don't think so. I've said this before. First of all, we are in an extraordinarily violent time already, and we should continue to expect to see the kinds of localized violence that we have seen. Please never forget that we lose people to gun violence every single day. And more than half of the mass shootings are domestic violence, which is, in a weird way, part of this, in that they are about dominance. They are about making people do things that a certain person wants them to do that they are refusing to do. And but the thing about going into a civil war, a political civil war, a full-fledged civil war, is that in order to do that, it has to be quick. The way that the Confederate leaders got people to fight for them and seceded was by doing it really quickly. So the state of South Carolina at the time in 1860 was the only state in the Union where the state legislature picked the electors. So they were actually sitting when Lincoln was elected, and they quickly reorganized themselves into a secession conference and took the state out of the Union long before he was ever in office. And they did it during the holidays. And so they went from there back home to Christmas parties and to drinking and to boasting in front of the ladies. And lots of people like them thought that this would be a great thing to start a new country. And of course, then it kind of stopped dead in the water. And one of the reasons that the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter in mid-April is that everybody is sort of coming to and going, oh man, we probably drank too much. And, now it's planting season and we need to get back to work. And that was kind of embarrassing, and maybe we'll move on. And they recognized that they needed a war to get people to come together. And that's one of the big reasons they fired on Fort Sumter. I could tell you more about that, believe me, but I want to get onto some other stuff. All right. You asked about the Federalist Society and confused it with the Federalists, which is such an obvious thing to do that I can't believe I've never thought about it before. So the Federalist Society is the group that has put so many of our reactionary judges in place. And that was quite deliberate. So what happens is really in 1954, under a Republican Chief Justice, Earl Warren, the Supreme Court begins to use the 14th Amendment to the Constitution to protect civil rights in the states. And the 14th Amendment to the Constitution happens after the Civil War. It's ratified in 1868. And what it says is it's looking at the people who write it in Congress. It's got to be ratified elsewhere, but Congress writes it. And they're looking at the southern states, where the southern states are putting Black Americans back into a form of quasi-slavery. And the Congress looks at that and they're like, what on earth are you doing? You can't do that. First of all, these Black soldiers in the American South were far more loyal than you white guys. So you can't do that. The federal government is going to protect them. So in 1868, it writes actually it writes it early. It writes it in 1866, but in 1868, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified. And what it says is that American citizens have the equal protection of the laws. That means that you don't get one set of laws and I get another. Equal protection of the laws and the due process of the laws. That is, you can lose some of those rights. For example, if I commit murder, which I don't plan to do, I can lose the same rights that somebody who has not committed murder can have. And obviously, it's not just murder, but in order to do that, I get to have a trial. I get to go through the due process of the laws before I lose those rights. That's what the 14th Amendment says. So in 1954, the Supreme Court, it doesn't really start then, but that's really when we look at it as the start, because history, right? The Supreme Court says, wait a minute here, in the southern states that are discriminating against Black children in the public schools, those kids have equal rights. You can't do that. And so with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, they say the 14th Amendment says you can't do that. And in 1957, the Eisenhower administration, Dwight Eisenhower is a Republican, uses federal troops to enforce desegregation in Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. That's why all those things are important. And with that, the use of the 14th Amendment that way in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, we get the right to contraception, the right to abortion, the right to marry whom we want, the right for desegregation. All these civil rights laws come from the justices using the 14th Amendment. So a number of people who don't like those things insist that this is not democracy, that people in the states voted for these laws that said you couldn't have contraception and said that you couldn't have, the Black people and brown people couldn't have rights. So what they start to say is this is judicial activism, and they want to return power to the states and put in place in federal judicial spots judges who will throw things back to the states. And that's what we've got now. That's the argument behind the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, is that it's the states that should make those determinations. But of course, that was just a smokescreen, as states' rights always is. All it says is that even though the majority wants this, we're going to take it back to the states, where the states also get to determine who votes. So we get to have our own way, so long as we can buy up the legislature. And by that, I don't necessarily mean bribes. I mean, we can have enough ads on television that people vote for our people, and then we get to do whatever we want. That was a quite deliberate effort to take over the courts, in part based on a document that was written in 1971 by a guy named Lewis Powell, and became known as the Powell Memo. And in it, he said, for the Chamber of Commerce for whom he was working, listen, those of us who don't like this government that is protecting civil rights and regulating business and providing a basic social safety net and promoting infrastructure, we need to take over the media and colleges, and especially the law. And on the basis of that, in the 1980s, you get the formation of the Federalist Society. Now, the other thing that somebody put in here in that question was that Samuel Chase was the only justice who has ever been impeached. He was a Federalist. That's why they call it the Federalist Society. But he's from way back in the very, very early 1800s, and he was an attempt of Thomas Jefferson to purge the government of his enemies. Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. That was the name of his party. That's what it was called in those days. It wasn't the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It was its own thing. And he wanted to get rid of Federalists, which was the other party in the government. And Chase was a pretty easy target because Chase was incredibly erratic. He drank too much. He was all over the map. He was an easy guy to go after. But then they tried to do somebody else as well, and that was it. And people were like, cut it out, dude, to Jefferson. They didn't call him that. I did. Saying you can't do that anymore. And that's when impeachment as a political tool is abandoned until the Clinton administration, when the Republicans use it in quite a political sense against Bill Clinton. How am I doing here? I'm covering lots of stuff here. All right, so it looks, Susan Curtis is, I'm sorry, somebody is suggesting that the chat is full of crap. That does not surprise me at all, because I can't monitor this the way we can monitor the letters when we zap trolls there. And also because, and maybe this is a good time to go to it, because since October 7th and the attack of Hamas on Israel, there has been an extraordinary amount of trolls and bots on social media. So both Facebook and Twitter are in huge trouble in the European Union, where they have laws against that. They're still able to do it in the United States. We don't have those laws, but the amount of crap on these sites since October 7th has been through the roof. And before I get into this, you've asked me a lot of questions about what's going on in the Middle East, and I have refused to answer them in the past, but I will give it a shot today, because I'm hoping at least some people honestly want to try and understand what is happening there. I expect when I do that, this thing is going to get absolutely swamped. So don't engage with those trolls, and we'll just zap them later on, okay? All right, so the first thing to say about what's happening in the Middle East is that you have to understand that there is a very long history in that region. And it's a very long history that I do not have. That is, I don't know the literature. I don't know I know of the religions. I am not of either of those religions. I don't speak the languages. I don't have any of that. And that's important to remember when you hear me talk about it, because my stakes are really different in what's going on here. That is, my stake is in the United States. That's what I know. That's what I'm trying to protect. And that's the lens through which I see everything that's happening anywhere. I am intellectually interested in other places. I am morally interested in other places. I'm beside myself about what's happening in Sudan right now. But how that's affecting the United States is something that I'm simply putting in newsletters sometimes because I just can't believe it. Similarly, the fact that Pakistan is expelling 1.7 million people across the border into Afghanistan strikes me as being a humanitarian crisis of extraordinary proportions, much like what's going on in Sudan. And of course, in South Sudan, which is being terribly hit by climate change. Those are not things that I tend to write about because my stake in them is moral. It is not, and your stake, you don't have to have the same moral stakes that I do. All right. So understanding that when you get into the Middle East, let me tell you some of the things to remember when you go into thinking about what's happening there. And I'm going to start here with the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is a far-right extremist. He is in power because he has a group of a coalition of far-right extremists around him. And that means that he has been defending the right, in his opinion, of Israeli settlers to move into the West Bank, to take land away from Palestinians in the West Bank. He's been defending that. Most governments around the world do not believe that that's okay to do. Okay, the second thing you need to know is that Joe Biden and Netanyahu do not get along. Netanyahu has been undercutting Democratic presidents and supporting Donald Trump since Obama. He's snubbed Obama repeatedly, snubbed Biden repeatedly, really played up his relationship with Donald Trump, and clearly was aiming to create a strong right-wing government that was allied with the Trump wing in the United States. And even when he did that during the Trump administration, a lot of people were like, dude, you're making a big mistake, because if Trump goes, what are you going to do? What are you going to do in America? But he thought he was strong enough that he could get away with that. Now, one of the things that he did to keep himself strong, as I understand it, mind you, I'm reading other people and I am not reading in the languages, is he helped to support Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that moved into Gaza, not into all of the Palestinian territories, but into Gaza after Israel withdrew. So Israel withdrew, I believe it was in 2005, and Hamas moved in 2007 and took control of Gaza. Gaza is really heavily populated, tons and tons and tons of people. But Hamas was not interested in governing, although it is technically the people supposed to govern that territory. They were interested in fighting Israel. So one of the things that they did is they dug tons of tunnels under Gaza City, and they put them in places that it would be very hard to hurt them because you would hurt civilians first. So, for example, there are a number of installations where there are lots of people. In Gaza, by the way, when we talk about Gazans and how many children are being killed, the population of Gaza is very, very, very young. So there's lots of children, unlike my state in Maine, where we're really old up here. They are very young in Gaza. Those demographics actually matter a lot for world history. All right, so Hamas wants to wipe out Israel. And one of the things that it does repeatedly, and has done repeatedly in 2014 and again in 2021, is to break into Israel, to attack Israel, to do a lot of damage, and then to push for a ceasefire, because of all the damage that Israel is doing in retaliation. And that enables them to regroup. It doesn't do much for the Palestinians except make sure that Israel stops killing them, which is a good thing. But it enables them to regroup. So at the same time that all this is going on, so Hamas is attacking Israel when it can, it's amassing power for itself. The Palestinian people are suffering terribly, and Netanyahu is moving into the West Bank. That is not a good situation. It is not a stable situation. And I will say here, which I shouldn't because I know people are going to repeat this, but as somebody who studies Indigenous American history, the taking of land the relationship between people and land and the taking of land, that to me is deeply problematic, and it's something that's not getting as much play in the American press as I wish it did. It's gotten some lately. It's gotten more lately. All right, so what happened? What happened is that there was a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. In order to keep that, in part, Netanyahu, and mind you, it's worth again reminding you, To me, this is a political problem. I see this, it's also a moral problem, by the way, and I definitely see the moral problem. But when you're trying to figure it out, for me, as you know, I like to keep my lane straight. And I studied politics. So the politics really matters, because you can say, for example, we shouldn't be killing babies. Well, obviously we shouldn't be killing babies. How do we stop killing babies? How do you move those pieces when you have a right-wing leader in Israel and a terrorist organization that is hiding behind babies, and then all the countries around it, and then the United States? It's not that easy. I mean, if we could all just love each other, that would be great, but a lot of pieces need to move. So what happened was that in order to keep the Palestinians from getting the kinds of political power they needed to be able to fight back against his moves into the West Bank, for example, Netanyahu supported, not totally supported, but certainly looked the other way as Hamas managed to keep itself powerful, because that meant that no other Palestinian groups could rise to challenge their authority in Gaza. All right, I hope you're with me on this so far. All right. So what happens is that Israel and Saudi Arabia begin to look as if they're going to make peace. Saudi Arabia is going to back down from its call for getting rid of Israel, and they're going to come up with a working peace. They do not, that idea really threatens Iran. I'm sorry, lots of moving pieces, I said this. Iran does not want Saudi Arabia to make peace with Israel. They don't want this idea of an economic development corridor through the region, which is what was on the table. And they support Hamas. They also support Hezbollah in Lebanon, both terrorist organizations. So just as it looked as if that peace might happen, and mind you, the Palestinians are upset because the Abraham Accords under Trump cut a deal with the UAE and Bahrain and some other people, some other countries that cut out the Palestinians. They were supposed to have a say in what happened in that region, and they just cut them out. They just ignored them as if they didn't exist. So that also laid the groundwork for the trouble that was coming. And on October 7th, which I will point out is Vladimir Putin's birthday, and he always likes to shit on his birthday. He always cares about dates. Hamas attacked Israel in full force in this big plan that had been going on for a while, and which now there's been at least one report that said they intended to start a war. And they intended to start a war because it would stop the potential peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So they come out, they kill, the number's been revised, about 1,200 Israelis in this horrific attack, and they kidnap about 253 others and take them back to Gaza. So Israel responds. All right, that's where we're going to start right there. And now let's take what happened from after this horrific attack, and it is a horrific attack. Okay, this is against the laws of war. They go after civilians, they rape, they butcher. I mean, it's really bad news. Don't make anybody have any doubts about that. You will see crap online saying it's made up. It's not made up. All right, and I can tell you how I know that if you care, but just take my word for it on that. I always tell you not to take people's words for it, but okay. So what happens is that Israel is its own country. It can do whatever it wants, right? Except the U.S. is Israel's sponsor. So one of the things that frustrates me is people are screaming for Biden to stop the things that Israel is doing. And he really can't stop them from doing everything they want because they are their own country. You know, he can certainly put a lot of pressure on them. And he does, if you remember this, because Biden's interest is to make sure there isn't World War III. So the first thing that he does is he comes out And he says again and again and again, and you can see this in all the speeches from Biden and Blinken and from Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. She's really important to watch because she's talking about this too, is they keep saying, if anybody else is thinking about getting involved, don't. Don't. And so we move to carrier groups. That's not just carriers, that's airplanes and people and all kinds of things to the Middle East region. We take a bunch of steps to try and make sure that Iran does not get involved. So there have actually been a number of additional attacks on the U.S. from Iranian-backed militias since October 7th. And the U.S. has hit them hard 3 times, saying, don't do it. Do not start World War III here. Nobody has an interest in World War III. And that's a piece that I feel like is getting lost in this, because everyone says, oh, Biden's just backing Israel. Remember, Biden does not like Netanyahu. He does not like that government. But he recognized that he had to come out, at least this is my read on it, first of all, and say, we must not let Iran get involved. We cannot let Iran get involved. That's step 1. All right. But then it's a big problem because Netanyahu, remember, wants to flatten Gaza because he's got this right-wing coalition. And without this right-wing coalition, he's probably going to jail on fraud charges. So he wants to just pour everything in there because that's what his people want. And Biden and Blinken, if you remember, were madly running around the Middle East trying to do a couple of things. First of all, trying to get the hostages released. It is against the laws of war. I am not a lawyer. I'm madly reading on the laws of war, by the way, and I'm interested in how few articles there are out there about the laws of war. But one that I am very confident about saying is that you can't take hostages. That's a big no-no. And a lot of those hostages are from other countries. They're not all Israeli. In fact, I think the majority of them, other than Israelis, are Thai. You know, they just got caught up in this net. And some of them, of course, are Americans. So Biden and Blinken have been working incredibly hard to get the hostages out because they're being held against the laws of war, and these are people from other countries. So they're trying to get those out, and they keep saying, give up the hostages. We can't do anything until you give up the hostages. And that conversation is going on, I believe, right today. I've seen comments after comments after comments of actually, Gwen just said, Iran-backed militia groups have attacked U.S. bases and facilities in Iraq and Syria 41 times since October 7th. And we've hit back against that as well. All right, so they've been trying to get out those hostages. At the same time, they have been holding back. If you remember, which you may not, Israel said they were going into Gaza. They were going into a ground invasion of Gaza. And that did not happen for a long time. The Americans kept saying, you cannot do that. You got to be more surgical. You have to go in more gradually. Still, Israel has gone in incredibly hard, insisting that they are, in fact, obeying the laws of war. And one of the things in the laws of war is that you're not supposed to kill civilians, but if there is collateral damage, what they call it, of civilians under certain circumstances, it's all right. I don't know. I'm not going to take a stand on whether or not they're actually obeying the laws of war. There's an international criminal court that does that has been looking into Israeli behavior with regard to Gaza since at least 2021. They have not issued a determination for many reasons, I suspect, but Israel insists it is following the laws of war. It also insists that the numbers coming out of Gaza are not accurate. The UN says those numbers are. And the Americans have insisted that the Israelis, I'm sorry, too many names here. The Israelis must pay attention, must abide by the laws of war. I'll stop there. So at the same time, what's happening to the civilians in Gaza is appalling. And the fight that is happening right now is it the fault of Hamas, which has openly said, we don't care what happens to the Palestinians. There have been a number of interviews with the head of Hamas who says, yes, we don't care. We're making a point about the fact that Israel shouldn't exist. Or is it the fault of the people actually dropping the bombs? Now, you and I probably both have opinions about that. There is a legal system in place to decide that. But in the meantime, the United States has worked really hard to try and open up humanitarian pauses to bring stuff to the people in the Palestinian, in Gaza, Gaza, and appears to have managed to make that happen. And one of the things that frustrates the hell out of me is if you think that was easy, because Egypt does not want Palestinians coming into Egypt. It's had problems with resettlement of Palestinians there before. Jordan does not want Palestinians coming in. And so they were getting this arrangement so that some people could come out and aid could go in has been incredibly difficult. So if you follow the State Department and the phone calls, because they tell you every phone call that's being made, they are constantly working the phones, constantly trying to get people on board to help the situation. Now, at the same time, the Arab countries around the Middle East, they don't like Hamas either, but they also are recognizing how horrific it is, and the people in their streets are recognizing how horrific it is that the Palestinians are dying under this onslaught, and the Israelis, backed by the United States, says no more damn ceasefires, because every time we do a ceasefire, you regroup, the Palestinians' lives suck, and then you come attack us again. And so they're saying no ceasefire, but there is more and more a movement among the Arab world to say something's got to give here. So what's going to give is not clear. Hillary Clinton put a piece in the Atlantic today that offers the same solution that Biden and Blinken and Greenfield have been talking about all along, which is and she's quite explicit. Biden and Blinken were not, and Greenfield were not. Says we got to get rid of Netanyahu. His administration has to be replaced by a moderate administration. We need to get rid of Hamas so they can't keep this going any longer. And then we have got to have a legitimate two-state solution going forward so that the Palestinians have their own land that at first is probably run by some organization that is certainly outside the US or Israel, and that the Israelis have their own land. And that is the end to which they're trying to go. And one of the things that really just that I wish people understood is this is so damn difficult because there's so many moving pieces. And it would be really nice if Netanyahu wanted to be reasonable, or that Hamas wanted to be reasonable, but neither one of them want to be reasonable. And the Palestinians are caught in the middle of all that. Sometimes you'll hear, well, they voted for Hamas. Well, yes, sort of, a very long time ago. And now many of them would like very much to be rid of them, but Hamas now rules Gaza with an iron fist. So there are lots of bad actors, and those bad actors are really badly hurting people who have no part in this. And trying to fix that, it would be really, really nice if it were easy to fix that. But the one thing that really jumps out to me is it certainly does appear to me, and perhaps this is because I am generally very much in favor of Biden's approach to international affairs. It does appear to me that Biden and Blinken and Thomas Greenfield and the other people involved are trying really, really hard to get something good out of the end of this, to finally get a two-state solution. Whether or not they're going to be able to pull it off, God knows I have my doubts. But this idea that somehow Genocide Joe, as people have called him, is rooting for the death of Palestinians, I think is probably a reflection of all the bots and trolls we have going on here, which of course will take us into the 2024 election. And people like Vladimir Putin would like nothing more than for Americans to turn against Biden, because if we put Trump back in office, we're going to be looking at a very different outcome of the Ukraine war, which, by the way, seems to be going quite well for the Ukrainians these days, not that you're hearing about it, and a very different outcome for the globe. So I guess at the end of the day, all I'm saying is it's really complicated. And maybe the best thing to do is try to figure out who's trying to do the right thing, because there's no good guy here. And there are lots of bad guys. And it's a really complicated situation. All right, that's about all I know. Just leaving you on a good note. My greatest concerns, somebody asked, my greatest concerns are that people will, that the radical right has taken over the nodes of our democracy, so that, for example, in Ohio, where people voted for reproductive rights to be added to the Constitution, the Republican state legislators are just saying, well, we're not going to do that. I don't quite know how that comes out. But my greatest hope, and the reason that I still have faith, is that I do think at the end of the day, Americans are paying so much more attention than they ever have before, and to our democracy and to what it will take to take up oxygen, to contest elections, to care about how we move forward in this world, that I think at the end of the day, we'll be able to do it. It feels like a really hard time right now. It is winter, and we got a long way to go before the next election. But, keep the faith. All right, I will talk to you later. I'm sorry about all the crap on here, and I will see you next week. Thanks for coming.